Okay, I think we'll get started now. I'm going to hand over to Stephen Haynes, our head of program, who will be facilitating this morning's session.
Thank you, Paris. Just to check, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, all good.
Fantastic. Well, thank you, Paris. It's an absolute pleasure to join you all today here and facilitate this morning's panel discussion on stress at work. As Paris said, I'm Steve Haynes. I'm the head of program for Mates in Mind, and I'm going to be hosting today's session. We're joined by three very esteemed guests, to whom I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with. Joining us are Stephen Beven, head of HR Research Development for the Institute of Employment Studies, Peter Kelly, Senior Psychologist at the Health and Safety Executive, and Steve Hales, Director of Health, Safety and Wellbeing at Tideway. And over the next 45 minutes, we're going to be exploring what do we mean by work-related stress, what causes it, how prevalent is it, and what's the impact of it. We're going to be understanding the employer's legal duty of care around stress management. We're going to be discussing how employers can better identify stress risks, what employers can do to better manage stress, and of course also thinking about exploring what the future of workplace stress management may look like in our ever-evolving ways of working. This will be a really interactive discussion, and we're going to be running some polls as well. So for those of you in the audience, if you've got questions during the session, as Paris has said, please put them into the chat function, and we will be coming to those during the Q&A at the top of the hour. Paris, can I ask you to move on to the next slide? Thank you. So let's kick us off. Let's get to the crux of it. What do we mean by work-related stress? I'm going to pass this question over to Stephen and to Peter. What do we mean by work-related stress? What does it mean?
Well, I can go if you want. Peter will come in with the proper psychological definition. But I think one of the problems about the word stress is it's almost become meaningless. It's not a medical condition. It's not on the Dictionary of Occupational Diseases and so on. It's a predisposition to a range of other conditions. I think in common language, it's become closely associated with mild to moderate mental illness, such as depression and anxiety. But it really is about a sort of response to pressure, a sort of feeling of control over how much you have to do in your job. And I guess the key thing about it is it's highly individual. So unlike things like noise at work or lead in the atmosphere, there's not sort of one standard measure of stress that will have the same impact on everybody. Everyone responds to these different pressures in different ways. And so stress really is a sort of portmanteau term for a range of emotional, sometimes physical responses that people have to pressure.
Thanks, Stephen. Peter,
I've got nothing else to say. No, well, I mean, the official our line, if you go onto HSC's website, is an adverse reaction to excessive pressure in the context of work. So what does that look like? You go into work, you've got a fairly clear outline of what you're expected to do, and then gradually over the course of the day you get extra things added, and that's absolutely fine if that happens 1 day a week. That happens 5 days a week, and for the remainder of your working career, then it's potentially going to cause you to experience symptoms of stress. So it's the key word is to look at is the adverse. So you have a reaction, it's an adverse reaction, and it's not just simple pressure, it's excessive pressure. Yerkes Dobson's law, we'll talk about it a little bit later, 1908, says that you need pressure to work. Too much pressure, you burn out. Not enough pressure, there are jobs like that, trust me. You also burn out, what they call rust out. So it's about getting the right level of pressure in work.
So in terms of negative pressures, Peter, what would you see as some of the main drivers of those adverse pressures?
Okay, well, I mean, if you look at the management standards, we categorized into six areas: demands, control, role relationships, support, and change. And that's because the evidence shows that if you have high demands, low control and low support, you're going to have the potential for work-related stress to occur, which may lead to the outcome of going off work with that and a possible diagnosis of depression or anxiety. So the negative aspects are those things in work where and I'm all of us here will have had moments where we go, where it just becomes too much, and what's happening is too much, and it's too much too often. So the negative stuff that comes along is that you need demands, but you don't need too many demands. You need the right level of demands. What's fascinating about this COVID-19 is you look at demands control support now in a COVID-19 world, and you take role, relationship, and change as the 6 areas. What has the pandemic done? Taken away control. What did it increase and decrease in the first wave demands? What's it increased in the second and third wave demands? Do we feel supported by doing these Zoom or webinars? Probably not, because we're inherently about people contact. I was at the pub on Monday night, sorry, straight in there, massive beer garden. But actually, it was nice to be with people, but also quite, oh, these people are drunk. It was that kind of, like, you know, a lack of control, wasn't it? So I think what we've done with COVID-19 has changed the idea that, you know, people say, well, you know, are those areas relevant today? I think they're more relevant than ever. But yeah, it's excessiveness. It's where it's beyond the ability to control.
Thanks, Peter. Stephen, just to expand a bit more on this, what are some of the risks then for an employer of not addressing work stress?
Well, it's in some ways it's a bit like, you know, boiling the frog. It's something that, you know, creeps up on you, and you know, sometimes people experience stress through some sort of catastrophic event, but actually, more in general, it sort of builds up over a period of time. And of course, in addition to what Peter was saying, there are other things that may trigger stress, which may not be to do with work. They may be that you're living with a chronic condition, or that you've got financial problems or other problems at home. The other thing I'd say, adding to Peter's point, is that the pandemic, particularly for people working at home, but not exclusively, as it exacerbated some of the other things in the standards about role conflict. And role overload. You know, if you've been homeschooling, then you are conflicted. You have been conflicted. It's very hard to perform well at work and also be a conscientious parent. So I think, you know, for employers, it's really hard sometimes to spot how that sort of cumulative pressure will build up in every individual. And as I said earlier, people respond very differently. So it puts quite a lot of pressure on, particularly first-line managers, to have the sensitivity and empathy to spot subtle changes in people's behaviour, their demeanour, even their appearance, the extent to which people are prepared to care for themselves, and so on. And that's hard enough face to face. It's even harder when you're doing it down a camera. And so the risk is that some of these things go even more under the radar and undetected for longer, and then you end up with more people having more serious problems than they perhaps would have done if the employer had had their normal sort of, you know, antennae working to identify that some of these things earlier on. So I think one of the dangers is that people will keep ploughing on and working to tight deadlines, and perhaps in toxic work environments or subject to harassment and bad management practices. And yet not have a mechanism for disclosing it or asking for help or understanding where they might get support. So it gets bottled up even more, and the risk is that that ends up in worse outcomes than would happen normally.
And I think that's evidence from the NHS and from other healthcare workers, as we see data coming through. 50% of sickness absence at the moment is mental health. It's not musculoskeletal disorders and others. It's mental health, because we've healthcare workers have worked diligently through these whole process, but actually they're now in the position like they're potentially burning out. So and
so
or suffering from depression or anxiety.
We've seen the re-emergence of the term burnout. It's not been something that's been in mainstream language in this area for very long, but burnout is something that's increasingly being used, not just in the NHS. The other thing that affects NHS workers is this concept of moral injury, which is that, you know, many healthcare workers, particularly in the peaks of the pandemic, were put in situations which essentially went against their training, against what they, you know, their values are, what their the ethos of care is about. If you can't allow relatives to attend you know, the bed of a very ill or perhaps even about to die relative, or you have to get them to say goodbye via an iPad, That is, of course, incredibly stressful for families, but for workers whose ethos is about providing the best possible care, the whole concept of moral injury, which is borrowed a bit from the military situation, has now been identified as a really serious issue for people working in frontline NHS care.
Yeah, I know an ICU nurse who was talking to me, said, you know, I've stayed protection, I've got through it, but the worst thing, the thing that I take home with me is I couldn't let the relatives say goodbye. And you know, they're a senior nurse, and they're saying it's the same for all the staff. It's that taking home bit, which is someone's died, but you haven't had the potential to let that family, you know. So.
I want to bring Steve into the discussion. I want to get a sense from Steve. What have you found in terms of you know, some of the signs, symptoms of, you know, work-related stress, both pre and during lockdown?
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I obviously couldn't disagree with anything that Stephen and Peter have said so far. I think the only thing I'd probably add is the need for understanding of how those levels of pressure fluctuate day by day, week by week, etc., and how they're influenced by external factors, including personal life. So Stephen touched on the importance of leaders. Probably extend that to the importance of everyone understanding the signs for their colleagues. But I think what is also needed is excuse me, is a sense of following the traditional hierarchy and looking to eliminate. What we tend to do is we wait to react and see a change rather than challenging the traditional norms. You know, in the industry I work in, for example, and I know we'll come on to it later, but fatigue is a huge issue. We've got a traditionally predominantly male environment, despite our best efforts to address that and have gender diversity. We have long shifts. We have extended working of long shifts. Added to all of the pressures that come outside of work, we're not doing enough to address that and create the right environment for people to thrive and to have positive mental health. Even if you had those environments, you would still have elements of individuals having excessive pressure and therefore suffering stress at work. But with the understanding of individuals, of recognizing those signs to be able to intervene, you would have a balance of proactive and reactive measures within the workplace. So I think it's about upskilling. I think there's certainly still a stigma around stress, as we've seen with mental health. I'm delighted that we've seen such a change over the last 5 years, certainly that I've been involved with Mates in Mind, and addressing that stigma associated with poor mental health. And if you'd asked me 5 years ago, running a survey within my organization, that we would have received a result that 78% of people were confident in speaking to their manager about mental health issue, I would have thought you were away with the fairies 5 years ago. But we can start to see things shifting, which I think is excellent. But addressing the stigma associated with being exposed to excessive pressure, having an environment in which you can openly discuss this with your line manager and not feel as if it's a weakness because someone alongside of you is managing the same workload particularly well, but for whatever reason you're not. Bringing all of that together, proactive and reactive, I think will put us in a much better place.
Thank you, Steve. Just staying on the same vein, actually, Paris, let's move on to the next topic, because I think this links in nicely. Peter, just from an agency perspective, what is our duty of care? What's the duty of care of employers when it comes to stress at work?
Your duty of care sits under Section 2 of the Health and Safety at Workers Act, which requires you to manage the health and safety of your employers. It doesn't just say, oh, the physical health is health. So that's both psychological and physical health. then you're required under the management regs, under section 3, to do a risk assessment. That risk assessment requires you then to, under reg 5, to put reasonable measures in to manage those risks. And for the purposes of stress, if you've identified stress and you don't do anything about it, then that would be a breach, because you have foreseeability. If you say, well, we're not going to do any risk assessments, then that's a breach, because you're required under section 3 to risk assess for work-related stress or any health and safety issues that impact on your employer. And if you think you can get away with both of those, it's inherently right in section 2 of the front end of the Act. You need to look after your employees' health and safety. So that would be the static standards, or that's the regulatory position. What in cases would we investigate? Cases where there's more than one. We don't investigate individual cases. So, we have just checking on our website, it's still up there. We have the criteria for what we'll do for investigations. We have investigated before, we've done improvement notices, and we've taken a very offhand approach for the last 10, 15 years. I think it's 17.8 million days lost to work-related stress, Stephen. Maybe it's time for the less of the carrot and more of the stick.
I think what I think.
Can I just say my name is
from...
Steve? I just felt I had to say it. Yeah, my name is Steve.
I think, no disrespect to Peter, but that is obviously what a regulator would say, and we have that regulation in place. But we shouldn't forget the duty of care we have as employers, and a moral obligation to our workforces. And I know Peter agrees with this, and he was obviously giving the Health and Safety at Work Act Section 2 and Section 3 standard response. But why wouldn't you do this as an employer? Why wouldn't you get the very best out of your workforce? Why wouldn't you encourage your workforce to be more productive, to be more efficient, to support them by creating the best environment, to create areas where they can thrive rather than struggle? And it is astonishing to see those figures, absolutely. But we mustn't forget the moral obligation that we have to our employees.
And that's my default, Steve. And we've done that for 12 years and for 15 years. So this is the moral duty, the right thing to do. But some employers just have ignored that and gone, actually, we don't care. Yeah. And actually they said, let's make you emotionally resilient and let's make you mindful, but let's not make changes to the job. Okay. You make someone mindful and resilient, you put them back in a toxic organization, they will die. Not in a literal sense, but I was using the illustration once at a meeting about fish. A lot of my fish were dying in the pond, and I thought it must be they're bad fish, and it wasn't that. The filter was blocked up, and it's the same. It's the same contextualizing it. You can have really good, strong fish, but if you have a filter that's blocked up, then it becomes toxic. So please don't quote me as die. It's insensitive.
No.
But people will be made ill. Interesting. You make people mindful; they're much more aware of how bad their job is.
Yeah.
Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Peter. It's a really interesting area, isn't it? So at the end of the day, we've got our legal duty of care to identify and mitigate drivers of work stress, but quite clearly, as Steve quite rightly pointed out, many of the interventions and approaches organisations take may not necessarily fall under that specific heading of addressing stress, but actually just good business practice. I want to throw this out to the audience. Paris, can we run our first poll, please? I want to get a sense around our virtual table in terms of, what do we currently do? Do we believe that our organisation currently meets its legal duty of care around the identification and management of stress at work? Don't worry, all responses are completely anonymous. Ignore the fact that we have the regulator in the room. So please be as honest as you can. Do you believe your organisation currently meets its legal duty of care around the identification and management of stress at work? Just give 5 more seconds and then we'll show the response. Okay. Thank you, Paris. So I would say that from the experience of mates in mind and the supporters that we work with, I would say that is quite representative of the organisations that we work with. Stephen and Peter, I don't know whether you've got any thoughts, observations around that. Does that surprise you? Does it, or not?
I don't think it surprises me, but it's 72%. Maybe it's time for a campaign. Actually, to continue to raise people's decision of what they should be doing. But you know, unfortunately, people don't see it as intrinsically as the same as a guarding on a machine. And actually, you know, asbestosis and guardings on a machine haven't actually led to the amount of illness that we see in mental health. So we need to be, unfortunately, I think the numbers are 74, sorry. The numbers obviously are not great.
Thank you for that. Paris, could we jump on to our next question? I want to explore with the group around, you know, what we can be doing. So what should employers be doing around addressing stress at work? Let's put that to Stephen.
Well, I think it sort of links to the poll answers in some ways, because and Peter's comments about the regulation. I mean, I think part of this is about just having a good sort of baseline measure of how much of it you've got. And I suspect part of the answers to the poll reflect that many organisations feel more comfortable putting in place measures to tackle stress when it arises, rather than putting in measures to assess its magnitude and its risk. So I suspect one of the problems that Peter and his colleagues at the HSE has is that too few employers are doing a regular annual psychosocial risk assessment, and that has to be a good first starting point, because I mean, my worry is that too many organisations don't do it because they don't want to know the answers, because it means they've got to do something about it, and they also realise that the causes and the consequences as well as the cures are really complicated. You know, putting on a resilience programme or a mental health first aid programme will not cure it. Might give people more information about where to go for help. And again, echoing what Peter said, I think that the core of it lies in what type of work we're asking people to do, the extent to which those jobs are doable, the extent to which people have control over what they do in their jobs, and the extent to which they feel supported by the organisation, their line manager, and by their colleagues. And quite often, the core of it is that people's workload is too much out of their control, that it's excessive, or that they're doing jobs where the tasks aren't really linked together. You know, they don't have any intrinsic meaning. You know, their jobs are made bigger, but they're not made more significant or more meaningful. And I think the sort of unpredictability of workload and working patterns and so on makes things quite hard for people if they don't feel they have any influence or discretion within those jobs. So I think measures around job redesign, supported by mechanisms to make sure that if people do feel under pressure, that they've got some sort of outlet or some sort of form of support, are really what this is about. And so it goes back to this whole debate about job quality, good work, effective job design, and making sure that jobs you know, are that unique sweet spot of being able to produce high levels of productivity and output, but also being fulfilling for the person doing the job. And if you can get that unique blend, then you've got work which is healthy for people as well as productive. We're not asking organisations to compromise on productivity, as long as people's health and safety is secured. But we know, and Steve Hales was pointing to this, that people who are doing jobs that they find fulfilling and rewarding, which they get some sense of meaning from, are automatically more productive. You don't need to worry so much about this sort of thing, because their work has therapeutic benefits for them from a psychological point of view.
They're also in the top. They're also in the top 500 companies in the Times to work for. The top 100 all have health and well-being, and their people look after. And remember this holds 10,000 files. 40 years ago, I could walk into an office and knew I was expected to do because there was a file in front of me. Now I can take this home 24/7, and I can keep it by my bed, and I can answer emails at 1, 2, and 3 in the morning. Take control of the IT systems and things around you. You can, and Volkswagen did this, switch these things off for receiving emails at 7 o'clock in the morning and come back on 6. Did Volkswagen go bust? No. Did they get an improvement in health and their performance of engagement and their general sense of wellness? Yeah. Interesting, isn't it?
Thanks, Peter. Thank you, Steve. I'm going to come to you in a moment, Steve, because I want to explore some good and bad practices. So actually, what can we do in reality? What works on the ground? We know stress management looks different for different organizations. But Paris, let's go to our second poll. Let's get a sense around the table around what we currently do to identify work stress and to identify work stress. So let's think about what we currently do to identify those exposures to work stress at the moment. So tick all those that apply on the screen. So obviously this is just a random selection of different types of ways in which you can do it. Stephen made reference to the HSE management standards regular psychosocial risk assessment, the top one. Okay, we'll just give you another moment and then we'll show the results. Okay. Thank you, Paris. Okay, so that's really encouraging to see. I would say from my experience, there's certainly a growth in the number of organizations using tools such as the HSE management standards to better understand issues around work stress. Definitely seeing that commitment from leadership within organizations starting to grow a lot more. And the focus groups, I think, is a really key one as well. I remember focus groups, employee representative groups, etc., etc. Okay, so Paris, if you can just jump onto the next slide, let's think for a moment, and I want to put this question to Steve in terms of what do you see? Because obviously, Steve, you come with that added advantage of not only experience within Tideway, but of course your wider supply chain as well. What would you see as some of the the good and the less good practices around work stress that you've seen out there?
Yeah, just before I come on to that, interesting on that poll, I know we don't vote, but I don't think I would have ticked the first 3 on formal stress management risk assessments within Tideway. One of the core elements is employee engagement and asking your workforce what it's like to work here. Delving into the different areas around your shift pattern, the expectations of your manager on your workload, the freedom that you have to make decisions, whether you're being micromanaged, trying to tease out all of the points that, when all pulled together, create a solid environment. And I think, without picking specifics, the real successes we have had is where that engagement is employee-led, and the employees, obviously with the support of the leadership team, have the freedom to do different things. So we made contractual obligations in the first instance about, for example, local community engagement, volunteering. It's well known that that when you volunteer, it improves your mental health and well-being when you give something back. So to give time in the working day for individuals to explore that ticks one box. It doesn't necessarily mean that that individual isn't exposed to excessive pressure and therefore subjected to potential work-related stress. But it gives one element to that. The fact that you've got healthcare available on site, that you can go and talk to a healthcare individual. The fact that you can access health services that, because you're working in construction and you're generally transient and you're therefore not necessarily registered with a GP or a dentist, to provide that service and to give people the time to go and take advantage of that service ticks another box and takes another worry away from that individual. We have a requirement for fatigue management assessments, as Peter would expect us to have, but we've also made commitments on maximum shift patterns, and any deviation from that has to be approved in the first instance, and that has to come with an extensive justification. And the main part of that justification really is, have you spoken to the workforce? What are the workforce telling you about this? So at the heart of all of this is employee engagement and just asking what they want to do and giving the freedom to do that. When we first set up Tideway, we said that we wanted facilities on site to be equivalent to what they would be in head office. Traditionally in construction, the facilities on sites are appalling. Why would your workforce go through a turnstile, yet your office staff go through a nice reception area with glass doors and panels, etc.? So making it equivalent across the board, giving the right facilities. And we had all these fantastic ideas that we were going to allow them to have pool tables and gyms and this, that, and the other. That's not what they wanted. When we actually asked our employees and our workforce and our supply chain, it was the basics that we considered in our head offices. It was access to showers that worked. It was enough showers that for the workforce. It was space to accommodate everyone in their changing areas. It was to create lockers that had clean and dirty areas, so there was no cross-contamination between their workloads. Very, very simple stuff that most of us take for granted. And if we'd taken a top-down approach, thinking we knew best and we knew what was going to create that right environment, we would never have got the success that we did until we asked what was actually required. So engagement is the key to this, Stephen.
Thank you, Steve. That's a really, really key point, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you've got the excellent guidance and advice from bodies like the HSE, and then you've actually got, I think this key theme that we're bringing through here is the fact that actually it's about making it work and relevant for your business. And I think, Steve, I think you've hit a really key point there on the head around, making sure that we listen to our employees. In a sense, our annual psychosocial risk assessments are means to help us do that, but they won't necessarily work with every single organization. But finding the way in which you can capture that information is really, really critical.
But Stephen, so just to challenge that, if you go to a tunneler or you go to a pit boss and you say, I want you to complete an annual psychosocial assessment, you're going to get short shrift. You've got to ask these questions in a way that allow individuals to engage, and this is vitally important. And even engagement surveys, we've tried to broaden that. We give rewards for completing the survey. There's prizes drawn out of a hat if you complete the survey. But all we want to get is genuine and honest feedback. But if you say, I want you to complete a psychosocial risk assessment to those people, it's just going to go over the top of the head.
And that is, it's pivotal in it. I mean, I've worked with the foundry sector for 18 months on mental health. I had to understand them, and I had to understand their language and understand the way they work to make sure that the campaign we did on mental health was relevant. And I walked into a foundry, and the lad that was there went, "Load of garbage, this." And that was at the start before we'd even, we were using him for a series of pictures. We're trying to say, would you do this at home? We actually started the campaign by saying, I can't be asked. But there you go, we couldn't get that through the system. But that was what they wanted. But the point is, at the end of it, he came up to me, big lad, barely just took this molding metal mold onto his shoulders, like it weighs 30 kilos, like nothing of it. And he said, take a picture of this, and his big smile, and as he's walking out, he said, get it. Because we made it relevant, and I think that, you know, Steve, that's what it is. You know, it's what you do in the workplace to have those conversations, and it can't just be about doing a survey or anything else. It's those conversations you have with your line managers and with other people. Make it real.
It's where the real successes come from. It's where the real creativity comes from. Your survey can be useful. I think the important thing is when the survey gives you a set of data, what do you then do with it, and how do you address that? And if you have employee working groups to work on that, you get a twofold benefit. One, you get real tangible benefit because it's come from the people that it impacts. But secondly, you also get that thing that Stephen referred to, you get fulfillment. Those that have been part of the employee working group that have had the autonomy and the authority to change this, and the freedom to change this, get a real sense of fulfillment out of it and see a positive change.
I know a utilities company that put a garden shed on the back of a trailer, stuck it right in the middle of their headquarters. A set of steps, did nothing, left it there, and people's curiosity just got them to get in. It was the head shed, and then the engineers who were out in the field said, well, why can't we do that? So they said, you know what they did? They took the trailer with the shed on the back of a lorry, and they went into the field. They dropped it there and they drove off, and they did that all across where they had field engineers, and it had the same impact. Creativity is really important.
That leads us nicely into, I think, the next piece about what are we actually doing. And Paris, let's run our final poll. So let's think for a moment about what are some of the things that we actually do at the moment within our businesses to address and manage stress. So we've done how do we identify it? What sort of things do we actually do at the moment? Again, this is just a random selection of just some of the many different ways in which we do it. Give you a moment to complete. Again, please tick any that apply. Okay, thank you, Paris. Let's jump on to the next slide. Okay, that's interesting. Steve, over to you. Any thoughts on those findings? What stands out for you?
Wow. What stands out for me? I'm going to be quite brutal here. I found those answers quite boring. I think they're decades out of date. There are certain things in there that are obviously regulatory requirements, and I'd be surprised if anyone on the call doesn't have policies and whatever in place. I just think we're missing a trick. You know, it's 2021. We've just gone through probably the hardest year that many of us have had to endure in our lifetime. Our employees, our workforce expect something more. This is very management system related. This is not touching on what individuals want and need out of their workplace. And I think it needs to be much broader than that. It's interesting to see 78% providing a helpline. It'd be interesting to see how many actually use the EAP, because historically they're not particularly well used. That might be because people aren't aware and we haven't done enough to proactively push them, but it's also what the EAP provides. I just really think that the 5 options there are probably 20 years out of date.
And can I just show you what I do when I go in to a factory or a place of work and I ask for the policy, if they what they've gone on stress, and they produce a folder. I go, because if there's dust on the folder, that's how much they prioritize it.
Yeah.
And that's all it is. It's a paper holder where the dust collects if it isn't live and it isn't real and it isn't active. And simply having a policy does not mitigate your risk. And if you were to not be taken on by HSE and you went before a court, the provision of a policy in itself is not regarded as a mitigation. So you could still find yourself before the courts, and you might justify it by saying, I've got these things. You've got to be proactive in managing it.
And questions obviously more detailed around, do you have flexible working in place? Is it measured? Is it applied? Do you have volunteering schemes? You know, all of the things that I've talked about that are peripheral to your day job, but create an environment that is far more endearing and makes it a pleasure to work at. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that's the case across all of our sites. At the end of the day, we still have people fixing steel and pouring concrete. But what we can do in there is look at how we can work with them to make that a much better environment.
Yeah, and Walker, remember this, Walker had a stress policy.
Yeah.
So let's before we can move to the Q&A, let's just move on to our final question, which is actually I want to put to you, Stephen, in terms of what the future of stress management looks like. So we know we've got to identify, and we know we've got to manage effectively, and that's got to be relevant to the business. I think critically, what all of you have alluded to here is making it relevant to your business, but listen and engage with the workforce. Use the templates that are there, but make sure that we're actually making them relevant and workable for our business. But what does it look like now as we go forward? Because we, as Steve quite rightly pointed out, we've just gone through one of the most significant change in workplace history.
Yeah, I mean, Steve Hales has nailed it, I think, and I think if Tideway are doing all those things, and that's brilliant. I mean, I think there are things you can do. EAPs can be really useful, but I think you've got to be a lot more of a proactive commissioner and purchasers of EAPs, and actually, say much more proactively what you want. And my experience is that some of them are actually very responsive to that. I suppose there are two things I would say about the future. One is about the real concern about more precarious work. We know that if people are in jobs where job security and the temporary nature of their work is increasing, then that increases the risk of mental health problems. And I suppose if in the short term, as we come out of the recession that's been caused by the pandemic, if employers are understandably nervous about recruiting people on permanent contracts and so on, the thing they have to be really careful about is that people in more precarious work are more at risk of a mental health problem. I would say a bigger issue is that we are increasingly, as an economy, a knowledge-based economy. We rely on the know-how and creativity and innovation of our workers, and so it's sort of brain work for a lot of the time. Increasing proportion of people work in the service sector or in high-tech manufacturing and innovative manufacturing type organisations. People's ability to bear a high cognitive load is sometimes vulnerable. We know, I did a piece of work for Make UK, formerly the Engineering Employers Federation, which looked at the impact of people working at high intensity for long periods of time. And what we found was that if they had high levels of control in their jobs, if they're able to have an influence over how things were set up, how quality standards were monitored and so on, people are able to sustain really high levels of performance, even under high levels of pressure and intensity. That's because they're doing the stuff that Steve was talking about. They're giving people a sense of involvement and purpose and meaning in what they're doing. They can see that what they're doing is about achieving something really exciting in their jobs. I'll just tell you a really quick story about a study I did in the NHS where we turned this on its head and said, what could your employer do to improve your well-being at work? And no one said fruit, Pilates, gym membership, any of that stuff. What they said was that these are the top 4 answers. Tell us what's going on in the business. Involve us in decisions that affect our future. Treat us like adults and give us the resources to do our job. And that's how they thought about well-being. They didn't medicalize it. They didn't think about it in terms of HSE or World Health Organization definitions. It's about having a decent job in a decent organization that you care about and that cares about you. And to quote my mate Carrie Cooper, his view is that we need to get rid of the managers who don't buy into that. If managers take on the responsibility for people management, then they should be interested and authentic about the way they do it. And if all you're doing is climbing the greasy pole because you're a good engineer or a good accountant or a good marketeer, and the people management bit is the bit you have to do in order to get the higher pay, you're in the wrong job. So I think one of the things that this whole pandemic and working from home and all the turmoil has shown in terms of management of mental health is that in the future, managers who think that a random act of kindness is a sign of weakness have got no place in a management job.
And that, Stephen, that's a helpful sort of clue into that. What we've done is our talking toolkits for line managers. How to have conversations with your staff about work-related stress. They're designed for different sectors, and they're there. Actually, once you start having the conversation, I think that's as Stephen has said, is part of the process. If you're not sure, go onto our website, talking toolkits for stress, and you'll get a guide that will take you through those conversations that you need to have, and to make it normal to have conversations.
The future of your business depends on it, because the new generations coming into employment, and we wonder why we're going to have a skills gap and how we can't fill that skills gap within my sector. It's because we haven't created the environments that are attractive to the new generation. They expect flexible working. They expect all of the things that we've talked about. We've got to move with that change. You can't turn around and say to somebody, well, if you're not prepared to work 12-hour shifts, 7-3, 7-4, then it's not the industry for you. If we do that, we will die. Simple.
Yeah. And it's not even the ones that are in now, the ones that were like, you can't work from home, you can't do this, have been at home for the last 12 months. Game changer. You can't say you can't do it anymore because you did it. And now you're going to say you can't do it because what you're really going to say is we don't trust you. And it's a trust issue. It's about actually trusting your people. Do you know what? We're in a recession, and but we're actually getting through this because we're trusting our people to do the jobs that we do, even when they're not in an office or when they're not physically there. Crazy, isn't it? It took a pandemic to actually change the direction of how we work, but let's embrace those changes that are going to come about. Talk to your people.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. Now, I'm going to hand us over now to Paris to facilitate the Q&A. Now, Peter, I'm very conscious that you also have to run to another webinar very imminently, so I'll appreciate if you're not on there, not on the full Q&A. So as we come to the top of the hour, now there was a question, there was a number of questions that came through in advance of the session. I'm just going to kick off with one of those, and then I'll hand over to Paris. One of the questions which came through was, what might be some of the visual signs that members of my team are struggling with stress, with work-related stress? Stephen, can I just put them over to yourself? What might be some of the visual signs that my team are struggling?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose it's partly about, as a manager, recognizing what sort of normal behavior might look like on behalf of your team members, and then spotting any variation from that, which may not have an obvious cause. And it's really important to bear in mind that we're not trying to get our line managers to be clinical psychologists at all. We want to be human beings and have a degree of awareness and empathy and emotional intelligence and so on. But if someone is looking unwell, or they seem distracted, or they seem upset or withdrawn, sometimes you may know that there are issues going on at home, and you may put two and two together, and you may be able to provide some support, or at least ask people how they are and so on. But they tend to be sort of fairly obvious physical or behavioural differences that people exhibit because they're showing the signs of some sort of distress. It's not your job as a manager to make a judgment about what they are or what the causes are. You just, being as a human being, trying to react to the fact that someone's behaviour or their demeanour may be different. They may be more short-tempered, they may be more irritable, they may be more withdrawn from their colleagues. those are the sorts of things that you should be looking out for.
Thanks, Stephen.
By the way, the same things you look out for in your family or in your best friends. Why do you switch it off when you come in work? Why do you go, can't do that? Oh, he's not very well. He's not having a great day. Well, if your best mate's not having a great day, your work colleague cannot be having a great day. Ask the question and go, I think, Stephen, is it? Why be different? Why be different in the context of work?
That's a very good point. Thank you, Peter. Steve, this is a question and a theme that was quite common with many of the questions that came through in advance, which was around what changes should we be looking out for and how might we best support them. From your experience, one of the questions that was expanded upon here was about what about the difference between home and or site-based workers? How might we best support those that are home-based, and how might we best identify those home-based compared to those in an office? What sort of things might be different for us?
Yeah, it's interesting, and obviously, as I mentioned before, the pandemic has given us an additional challenge to work through. One of there's kind of two ends to this for me. On Tideway, we've been very conscious of the divide that has been created between our teams that are able to work from home and our site-based teams that fix steel and pour concrete and tunnel, where it's obviously impossible for them to do their work from home, and where we had a collaborative approach prior to the pandemic. The fact that half of or a percentage of the site-based team are able to work from home, it's creating a divide. So we need to bring that back together. Those that are working from home and are able to work from home, it's about how you keep that connection. When you lose that physical connection, it's how do you try to maintain that connection? In the early days of the pandemic, we were very conscious of this, and arguably we spent more time checking in with each other. We tried to replicate the round the water cooler moment when you talk about the rugby at the weekend or whatever it might be, and we went too far, and it was almost, there was so many Teams meetings that you were engaged in Teams meetings to try and check in on people, and you were actually increasing the work-related pressure on those individuals. One important thing that we introduced through our mental health working group was a thing called tribes, and what we decided to do was to have an appreciation that people are dealing with different issues whilst working at home. So we created individual groups of similar challenges. So we had a group of people that were homeschooling, we had a group of people that were caring at home, we had a group of people that had moved back with their parents for the first time in years, we had a group that were living with their partners for the first time in years, full time, because of the nature of the work. And the idea of that was that it was bringing people together just to turn around and say, this is how I feel, and someone else on the call to say, that's exactly how I feel. So the individual didn't feel they were alone in getting through this challenge, and then collectively trying to understand how they could support each other in getting through that, and what the organization could do to help them in that, and there would be feedback coming as a result of that. So that was just one element that I thought was particularly successful.
Thank you, Steve. Paris, we've got just a few minutes left. Can we go to yourself just to pick up on a couple of those questions?
Yes, so there have been quite a number of questions and comments throughout the session, so I'm glad that you've all been clearly enjoying it, and there's some really insightful comments. I think I'm only going to be able to pick out a few, and we'll hopefully be able to get back to some of you after the session. So one of the questions was around responding to work with a vulnerable team member who are frightened to take support or offload workload for fear of being sidelined or perceived as not being able to do their job. How do we support those individuals? And I think this is in relation to flexible working and trying to make sure that there's the perception of how we're supporting them versus what's actually going on.
Thank you, Paris. Stephen, who would like to pick that one up?
I'll come in with that, if I may, in the first instance. I think one of the positives the pandemic has taught us is that you can work effectively and productively from home. And whereas previously, whether you had a flexible working policy or not, the uptake was probably limited in most areas because of those exact reasons. People were feeling, well, if I've got childcare issues or whatever and I need to come in the office later, people will see me coming in the office late, but don't necessarily see me staying late. So I think there's a real positive come from the pandemic in that sense. I think from a manager perspective, it's about understanding your teams and understanding what makes them thrive and what makes them tick. Within Tideway, we've used insights to get everyone a profile. So it's very similar to Myers-Briggs. And then as a manager, you can look at your team's profile and see what really pushes an individual's buttons and what turns them off. Not everyone is true red like me, and why would I expect everyone on my team to be like that? In fact, quite the opposite. I want to have a blend of attributes across the team. So understanding those individuals and what will make them thrive, speaking with them about how they would do it differently, how they feel they can manage the challenge, because they've generally got the solution. It's getting away from this top-down dictatorial approach and getting individuals to have the autonomy and the flexibility to get there in the way that they see fit.
Thank you, Steve. Steve, do you want to add anything to that question?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've been doing some research during the lockdown of people working from home, and I'd echo what Steve was saying. I think one of the things we found is that, you know, by and large, people's productivity seems to have held up pretty well. But what we found is that those people who report higher productivity than prior to the lockdown, also the ones with stronger mental health. We've used the WHO-5 measure of mental well-being. And in fact, in some cases, the most highly productive people have got twice the mental health score for people who have least productivity. So there's a strong correlation. Second thing is we found that those people who report better mental health are also the ones who have more frequent and beneficial contact with their line manager. So it's not rocket science. What I would say is it's just a story from a manager that we talked to as part of one of our bits of research. She was saying that as a manager, she realized that just asking someone how they are means that it's a really easy question to spat away. You just say, I'm fine, you know, can we just talk about my projects or my clients? So she's changed what she said. She now asks two questions, which now open up the conversation to a more genuine conversation about how people are. She asked two things. What are the things in your life or your work that are giving you energy at the moment? And what are the things that are depleting your energy? Now, those answers to those questions, you can't just say, well, I'm okay. You have to give a positive answer as well as something that's, you know, getting you down a bit. And as a manager, your job is to spot how you respond to both of those things, because, you know, we all have mental health. What you need to do is as Steve Haynes was saying, is build a way of developing a way of having a conversation which isn't threatening, which isn't stigmatizing. People are really worried if they put their head above the parapet, in some organizations at least, and admit that they're struggling psychologically, that means that they'll be seen as weak or unreliable and not promotable. You can't give them difficult or complex jobs. You can't put them on, you know, cross-functional project teams because they may not last the course. People are really worried that they'll get labelled. And so we need to use that sort of more empathetic approach to having conversations to encourage people to realise it's okay not to be okay sometimes.
Thank you, Stephen. I think that concludes our morning session. I'm conscious we're just over the top of the hour. We will pick up the questions, the additional questions we've not covered separately for everybody that's involved. The recording will be made available separately as well. On behalf of Mates in Mind, I would like to thank, my heartfelt thanks to Stephen Beven, to Steve Hales, and to Peter Kelly, who sadly had to drop off at the last minute. But I think it's been a really, really insightful and beneficial hour, and I think it's really given us some good, logical, practical tips around how do we best manage workplace stress. I'm Steve Haynes. I'd like to thank also to Paris and the rest of the team in Mates in Mind for helping pull all this together. And thank you very much.